individual achieves high office and thereby becomes universally well known, it's no longer necessary to introduce them by giving a list of all their positions and accomplishments. It's more appropriate to say, ladies and gentlemen, Robert Kennedy Jr.
Thank you all very much. I want to thank my friend Moses Zeimer, who's now on the board of directors of the Lake Ontario Keeper and has been one of the guardian angels of the waterkeeper movement around the world. And the thing that I think I most admire about Moses is his commitment to democracy in the media and his understanding long before, his pioneering understanding long before other people realized that the media is what makes our democracy function. And I talked the last time I was here about some of the decline in the environment and the attacks, this president's attacks on the environment in our country. And you know, these are things that the American people would be really angry at and indignant at if they knew about it. This president over the last 4 years has implemented or promoted 400 major environmental rollbacks designed to eviscerate 30 years of environmental law. He's put polluters in charge of virtually all the agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. The head of the Forest Service, a timber industry lobbyist. The head of public lands, a mining industry lobbyist. The head of the Air Division at EPA, a utility lobbyist. The head of Superfund, a woman whose last job was teaching corporate polluters how to evade Superfund. The second in command of EPA, a Monsanto lobbyist. And this week, the New York Times reported that within the White House, there was a American Petroleum Institute lobbyist whose only job was to review all federal science to take out any exculpatory statements about the fossil fuel industry and their connection to global warming. And his job was to lie to the American people. And the press, one paper, covered it for a day, and then you didn't see it anymore. And you know, this is the same press, the same media in our country that tolerated the impeachment of a president of the United States for lying about an extramarital tryst. And yet lie after lie has come out of this White House, and it's simply not covered by the American press. And that really is we have as a result of these policies that the president has implemented have imposed a tremendous diminution in quality of life in our country. And I'll give you a few examples. I have 3 sons who have asthma. 1 out of every 4 black children in our country have asthma. We have this epidemic of pediatric asthma, and we know that asthma attacks are triggered primarily by bad air, by ozone and particulates that's coming from 1,100 coal-burning power plants who are burning coal illegally. It's been illegal for 15 years. They were supposed to remove those materials. The Clinton administration was prosecuting the worst 75 of them. But this is an industry that donated $48 million to this president during the 2000 cycle and have given $58 million since. And one of the first things he did when he took office was to order the Justice Department and EPA to drop all those lawsuits. And then he went back and abolished the heart and soul of the Clean Air Act, this rule that required those plants to clean up 15 years ago. So today in the United States, there's no obligation for them ever to have to clean up. And according to EPA's website, if you go to their site today, you'll see that rule alone, that the abolishment, that one decision by this president, kills 18,000 Americans every single year, 6 times the number of people who were killed in the World Trade Center attacks. And yet, we didn't read about it in the American press. And you know, we're living in a science fiction nightmare where I'll be able to watch my children gasping for air on bad air days because somebody gave money to a politician. But we're not reading about it. About 4 months ago, the EPA announced that in 19 states it's now unsafe to eat any freshwater fish because of mercury contamination. In 48 states, at least some of the fish are unsafe to eat, again because of mercury that's coming from those same 1,100 coal-burning power plants. 1 out of every 6 American women, according to CDC, because of those contaminated fish, now has so much mercury in her body that that it's dangerous for her children are at risk for a grim inventory of diseases: autism, blindness, mental retardation, heart, liver, and kidney disease. I have so much mercury in my body. I got my levels tested recently just from eating fish. My levels are double the levels that are considered safe. I was told by the National Authority on Mercury Contamination that a woman with my levels of mercury in her blood would have children with cognitive impairment, some kind of like permanent IQ loss, permanent brain damage. And you know, today there's 640,000 children born in our country every single year who've been exposed to dangerous levels of mercury in their mother's wombs. President Clinton recognizing the gravity of this national health epidemic, reclassified mercury as a hazardous pollutant under the Clean Air Act. That triggered a requirement that all of those plants remove 90% of the mercury within 3.5 years. It would have cost them less than 1% of plant revenues, a great deal for the American public, but still billions of dollars for that industry. This is the industry that donated $100 million to this president. And 8 weeks ago, the White House announced that it was abolishing the Clinton-era rules, substituting instead rules that were written by utility industry lawyers that will require them to never have to clean up the mercury. And if the American people understood this, they would be angry. The problem is in our country, we have a negligent and indolent press that has simply let down the American people. The biggest lie that the right wing has been able to promote in our country over the past 10 or 12 years has been the lie that there is a liberal media in the United States of America. There is no such thing as a liberal media. There is a right-wing media, and if you look where people are getting their news, overwhelming number of Americans are getting it from right-wing media. 30% of Americans say that their principal news source is talk radio, which is primarily 90% controlled by the right. Another 22% say that their principal news source is one of 3 cable channels, CSNBC, MSNBC, or Fox News, all dominated by the right. Another 10% say their primary news source is Sinclair Network, which is the largest television network in America, and the most right-wing of all. The owner of Sinclair is a former pornographer, requires all 75 of his television stations to take a pledge that they will not report critically on the president or on the war in Iraq. These networks no longer have an obligation to serve the public. That obligation was abolished by Ronald Reagan in 1988. It used to be we had a doctrine in our country called the Fairness Doctrine that was passed in 1928 at the advent of commercial radio. And the Fairness Doctrine declared that the airwaves belonged to the public. They were part of the Commonwealth of public trust assets, that the broadcasters used them, but only with a license, but only with the proviso that they use them to advance our democracy and promote the public interest. They required them to have news divisions. The networks didn't want to do that. The broadcasters didn't want to do it because they're expensive and the viewership declines on them. There were 3 basic requirements of the Fairness Doctrine. One, that they have local control and diversity of control. They wanted to make sure that, that farmers in Kansas could get crop reports, that people in North Dakota could get tornado warnings, that people in the South could get country music, and that you wouldn't have, programming and news dictated by a few corporate epicenters around the country. Because of the destruction of the Fairness Doctrine, today in our country, 6 giant multinational corporations control all of the 14,000 radio stations in America, all 6,000 television stations, and 80% of the newspapers. So you have 6 guys who are basically dictating what Americans hear as news. The second requirement of the Fairness Doctrine was that they air issues of public import. You had to tell the news. They would have had to report on the environment, issues like the mercury, in our women and children, the ozone and particulates, global warming. But last year, according to Tyndall News Services, which is the service that analyzes the content on television, less than 4% of the 15,000 minutes of network news were devoted to the environment. And most of those were stories about, human interest type stories like whales caught in sea ice or a tiger escapes from the zoo. And they're not the kind of issues that we really need to know to advance our democracy. And the third requirement is that they tell both sides of the story. You couldn't have had a Fox News, under the Fairness Doctrine. You couldn't have had a Rush Limbaugh 24 hours a day on the same station. You could have had a little bit of Rush, but the station would have had to give you a little bit of something else of the other side of the story. But that's been abolished. And the broadcasters, what they immediately understood is 2 things. One is that they found out that you can't switch from a right-wing talk to a left-wing talk without losing a lot of your audience. If you have one strong right-wing guy, it's better to go right-wing all day long because that will retain your audience. The other thing that they came to understand is that it was much easier for them to get advertisers if they stuck with the right wing. Because if you have liberals on criticizing the automobile industry for making fuel-inefficient cars or criticizing the oil or chemical industry, that cuts down on the pharmaceutical industry. Those are all the biggest advertisers. And you're much less likely to get national advertisers, which these networks need. So the easiest thing for them to do is just give us right-wing stuff all the time. on weekends in the United States, they have these Saturday morning talk shows, where these pundits get on. We call them in our house the Saturday morning gas bags. But these pundits get in, and they posit that the reason that Bush won the election is because we have the red states and the blue states, and that the red states, there's this huge kind of moral war, a culture war going on in the United States, where you have the red states who are morally robust, and you have the blue states that are kind of degenerate and dissolute. And it's not true. And I'll tell you, first of all, I did this piece for Vanity Fair, and when I went out and looked at basically who was more moral, the red states or the blue states, using the criteria that most of us use to judge morality. And what I found was not what everybody assumes. I found the lowest divorce rate in America was Massachusetts, a blue state. The highest divorce rate was Texas, a red state. The lowest teen pregnancy rate was Massachusetts. The highest was Texas. The 10 lowest divorce rates in our country were all blue states. The 10 highest were all red states. The 10 lowest teen pregnancy rates, all blue states. The 10 highest, all red. Red state people are more likely to murder you, to impregnate your teenage daughter, to commit a violent crime against you, to commit a nonviolent crime against you, to watch Desperate Housewives on TV, to buy pornography, to buy degenerate video games like Grand Theft Auto, and so there is no moral difference between the red states and the blue states, at least in the way that they assume. And I've known this for a long time, because I go every year and I do about 40 speeches to red state Republican audiences, and I get standing ovations at almost every one. There's no difference between the reaction I get from liberal college kids and red state audience, because I'm talking about basic American values. And the only difference is that afterwards the Republican audiences come up and say, how come I never heard any of this before? And I have to say to them, it's because you're watching Fox News. And this confirmed what I have been saying for many years, is that 80% of Republicans are just Democrats who don't know what's going on. And if you look at, this is a real danger to American democracy, because you cannot have a democracy for long if you do not have an informed public. And this was a debate that we had from the beginning of our democracy, and I found out about this because I went back and looked at the Fairness Doctrine. There was this extraordinary debate then that brought up the older debate that happened at the beginning of our national history, where after the Revolutionary War, when they were developing the Constitution, there was a fight between people who said, led by Jefferson, who said we should have universal suffrage and everybody should get the vote, versus many of the other founding fathers who said, no, we can't afford that, because we have to keep the vote in the hands of the landed gentry, because the masses cannot be trusted, because they will, and this is a quote, but they said, they'll sell out to the first demagogue or religious fanatic or tyrant who comes along and offers them some kind of immediate welfare. And Jefferson himself said this, that the masses will trade 100 years of hard-fought liberties for a half an hour of welfare. From somebody who comes along and says, we'll give you a $300 tax break, and just sell out the Bill of Rights and let Guantanamo Bay, let us torture people in Guantanamo Bay, but we'll give you $300. And that the masses would sell out. And what Jefferson said is this: he was the greatest defender of giving the vote to everybody. And he said that the remedy for the tendency of the masses to accept welfare in exchange for civil rights and to follow demagogues and religious fanatics, that the remedy is not to deprive them of power, but rather to educate them, to make sure that we have an educated public. I hear environmentalists at some points, but I also hear, the Democrats, and I meet with these guys, the top Democrats a lot of time, and they're always talking about, how we have to change the message to reach more and more Americans, to reach the red states Americans. We need to change the message, or to invigorate, the base. And there's this debate: should we invigorate the base by going left, or should we broaden the appeal by going right? And to me, that debate itself misses the whole point. It's like, changing the language is like changing deck chairs on the Titanic. The whole system is broken and going down. The Democrats do not have the capacity to reach the American public because the bad guys own the bullhorn. They own all of the media, and there's no way for a Democratic message, no matter how you change that message, to penetrate that iron wall of right-wing controlled media in the United States of America. My book, Crimes Against Nature, I have a paperback version released this week, and it has a new chapter on it that describes this, this problem of what's happening to the media. One of the things I describe in it is there's a meeting that happens every Wednesday in Washington, D.C., in the offices of Grover Norquist, who's Americans for Tax Reform, who's one of the right-wing leaders. And at that meeting are the representatives of 40 right-wing think tanks, almost all of them funded by the biggest polluters in our country. The Heritage Foundation, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, all of these, phony think tanks with their phony scientists, who say there's no such thing as global warming and DDT is good for you, whatever. We call them biostitutes. And they assembled these guys on Capitol Hill and put their message out, the systematic message to the American public. Well, every Wednesday, the heads of these 40 think tanks meet in a closed shade session in Grover Norquist's office with some representatives from the White House, representatives from Fox News, Bob Novak is there, representatives from the Republican National Committee, Karl Rove, all these people, and they decide what the message is going to be, what the talking points will be for that week. For example, they may say, this week is the week that the White House announces President Bush's tax plan. We are going to say the tax plan is bold. Within 30 minutes of that meeting breaking up, you have a fax tree that has faxed the talking points, usually 1 or 2 pages, to 2,000 talk radio station jocks in our country. And Fox News, the talking heads on Fox News, Sean Hannity, et cetera, are all saying the same thing. It's bold, it's bold, it's bold. All these talk radio hosts are saying it's bold, it's bold. Americans are hearing from 100 different sources, this is a bold tax plan. And within a day or two, it has percolated into the mainstream press, and everybody's calling it bold. The next week, they may say, John Kerry is a flip-flopper. Everybody used that phrase, flip-flopper. And, by the end of a week, that phrase and that point of view has infiltrated the American consciousness and lodged there. And it becomes part of the way that we look at the world. And using that, this is the first time in American history where you've had a White House and a national press that are marching in lockstep with each other to deceive the American public. And using those methods, they are able to do anything they want to a Democratic candidate. They're able to portray, Al Gore as a liar, one of the most honest politicians we've ever had in our country, as a liar. Meanwhile, President Bush, who has been caught in whoppers every day since he got the job, is portrayed to the American public as an honest man. And they're able to convince the public that a war hero like John Kerry did something sneaky or devious during the war. And meanwhile, ignore the president's own war record, which is an absolute catastrophe. And so, this is a depressing picture because there's no way to penetrate that wall. And Democrats and environmentalists and people who have a progressive viewpoint, they have one agenda item. They have only one agenda item, which is corporate control and corporate profit taking. And, they fool the American public by embracing, giving themselves a moral veneer by saying this is about gay marriage or abortion. They embrace values. Really, all of those values that they claim to represent are simply hollow facades that conceal the one value that they really consider worth fighting for, which is corporate profit taking. They call themselves conservatives, but they have torn the conserve out of conservatism. They say that they like free markets, but they despise the free market economy. What they like, if you look at their feet rather than listen to their mouths, what they like is corporate welfare and capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. They say they like property rights, but it's only when it's the right of a polluter to use his property to destroy his neighbor's property and to devalue the public property. And they say that they like, local control and states' rights, but it's only when it means sweeping away the barriers to corporate profit taking at the local level. And they claim to love Christianity, but they have violated every one of the manifold mandates of the Christian faith that we care for the environment, that we treat the earth as stewards, and that we treat future generations with responsibility. And, you know, they have one value, and that's corporate profit taking. And I always say this about this White House that, you know, and this may be unfair, but I always wondered about this was how did they get so many draft dodgers in one place? You know, they got President Bush, you know, the National Guard, President or Vice President Cheney, 5 deferments, John Ashcroft, 6 deferments, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, you know, all their buddies, Dennis Hastert, Tom DeLay, Rush Limbaugh, all of them were draft dodgers, these chickens hawks, all of them were draft dodgers. And, you know, there's a lot of Americans who evaded the draft during the Vietnam era. But most of those were people who had moral qualms about the war, who felt that this was a bad war for America to be involved in. But not these guys. All of them loved the war back then. They just wanted somebody else to fight it. And it's because I believe that they don't understand the values that makes our country worth fighting for. The only value that they understand is corporate profit taking. And nobody in their right mind would fight or die for that value. And those of us who understand that our country is worth fighting for need to fight now to take it back from those who don't. Thank you all very much for having me here.